It began on a calm Sunday morning in a neighborhood that looked like perfection. The streets shimmered with the morning, sun lined with expensive SUVs and flags fluttering in the breeze. Everything about the place screamed order but not peace. Beneath that perfect symmetry, something rotten pulsed quietly. It was the kind of community where smiles hid suspicion and every outsider was a question mark waiting to be erased. Marcus hadn't noticed the glances when he moved in. He'd served his country, risked his life overseas, and thought he'd earned the right to any neighborhood he could afford. But some people didn't see his medals, only his skin. To them, he wasn't a neighbor. He was a disruption, a reminder of a world they preferred to keep. Out that morning when he parked his truck outside his own house, he had no idea he was breaking their unspoken rule, the one that said you can live here but don't belong here. By nightfall, that rule would be enforced the only way these men knew how, with fists, steel, and silence. But what they didn't know was this: Marcus wasn't alone. He had brothers, the kind who don't call the police. They bring the storm. The bruises on Marcus's face would fade in time, but the insult carved itself deeper than any wound. A man who had faced war, who had stared death in the eyes in places no map could pronounce, had been beaten not by enemies in uniform, but by men wearing polo shirts and neighborhood badges. Just 2 days before life had seemed simple, Marcus had just moved into the quiet suburb, after years of deployments chasing the stillness he thought he'd earned. His home was modest but proud, an American flag folded neatly on his mantel, medals lined in glass photos of men he'd fought beside men who'd never come back. To him, peace wasn't luxury, it was therapy. Every morning, he ran laps around the cul-de-sac, waved to neighbors, trimmed his hedges and tried to fit in, but the stares never softened. Cars slowed when passing his driveway. Notes appeared on his mailbox about neighborhood standards. He shrugged them off at first, assuming ignorance, not hatred. Yet something colder lurked beneath. The self-proclaimed Homeowners Association wasn't an official body. It was a handful of residents who believed they owned the narrative of the neighborhood. They met in garages and backyards, swapping grievances and pride, whispering about keeping the area safe. Then came the day it escalated. Marcus installed a security camera above his garage, a simple precaution. That single act was enough to ignite fury. To them, it was watching their homes breaking. Trust. The rumor spread like wildfire that he was spying, that he didn't respect the rules. Dusk, the whispers had turned into plans. On the night it happened, the air was thick and silent. The kind of silence that comes before storms. Marcus had just returned from an evening, jog sweat still fresh on his brow when headlights flared. Across his lawn, 3 men stepped out, their faces half covered, their arrogance fully exposed. What followed wasn't an argument, it was an ambush. The blows came fast, precise, practiced. They didn't want to kill him. They wanted to humiliate him, to remind him that in their world his strength meant nothing. When it was over, he lay on his own driveway, tasting blood, staring at the same stars he'd once looked at from foreign deserts. He thought of the oath he took, the flag he'd saluted, and the men he'd buried who believed that freedom was meant for everyone. That night, he realized freedom had boundaries here. The police came, took note, made promises. But the tone was detached, procedural, almost bored. The officers knew the attackers' neighbors, family men, local donors. They called it a misunderstanding, a scuffle, a mistake. Marcus saw it for what it was, a warning. He didn't sleep that night. He didn't rage, didn't curse. Instead, he sat in the dark, steady and quiet like a man planning, logistics, not revenge. On his wall hung a single photo, his Navy SEAL, Team 12 men in desert camouflage, arms crossed, faces unflinching. The kind of brothers forged in fire, not friendship. He hadn't spoken to them in years, not since they scattered across states and continents. But bonds like that don't dissolve, they wait. And as dawn cracked over the horizon, Marcus picked up his phone. His hands didn't shake. He didn't need to explain. He only had to tell them one thing, that a man they once called brother had been dishonored on his own soil. By the next sunset, that message would reach men who understood that justice didn't always wear a badge sometimes. It wore night vision and silence. By morning, the message had traveled faster than the news ever could. It passed quietly between men who owed Marcus their lives, men who had bled beside him in places where the sun scorched and mercy vanished. None of them needed context. The moment they read the brief line, just his name, and 2 words, they knew exactly what it meant across states, time zones, and lives they'd tried to rebuild. A dormant instinct reawakened. One man left a half-eaten breakfast in a diner and walked out without paying. Another shut his laptop in the middle of a meeting and never came back. The world called them civilians now, but beneath the surface they were still weapons disciplined, deliberate, and loyal beyond logic. By dusk, 5 of them stood at Marcus's doorstep. No greetings, no explanations, just a silent nod, a ritual, acknowledgement of what had been, done and what had to follow. That evening they sat in his dimly lit living room studying the grainy footage from his security camera. The video showed exactly what the police ignored 3 men in. Masks, confident, coordinated, brutal. They moved with precision, too comfortable, too familiar. They weren't afraid. They thought they'd written the ending. Outside, the neighborhood slept under its blanket of arrogance. The same cars in the same driveways, the same lights in the same windows. Nothing looked disturbed, nothing looked wrong. But that illusion was about to crack. Over the next 2 days, Marcus's brothers moved like shadows. They mapped the area, learned routines, noted exits and vulnerabilities. They saw how the self-appointed HOA gathered. At the same backyard every Friday, night laughing over beers, bragging about keeping the neighborhood clean. They noticed the leader, a man named Jeff, a former contractor who wore power like a hobby, the kind of man who mistook cowardice for control. The SEALs didn't talk about vengeance. To them, this wasn't rage, it was restoration. They'd seen what unchecked cruelty does in war zones, how it grows when good men stay quiet. What happened to Marcus wasn't just a beating, it was a statement, and statements demand response. Every night the team rehearsed. No weapons, no bloodshed, not yet. Just presence. They wanted fear to bloom first to let the men taste the same helplessness Marcus had endured. They started small. The first night every car belonging to the attackers had its tires deflated, not slashed, a surgical inconvenience. The next, the HOA's meeting. Chairs were rearranged in perfect military. Formation on the lawn, a message written in silence. "We see you." The neighborhood began to whisper again, but this time in fear. The same people who had once looked through Marcus now avoided his street altogether. They couldn't explain it, but they felt it. Something unseen had shifted. Meanwhile, Marcus's body healed, but his composure hardened. He didn't participate in their plans, he simply watched. His friends didn't need direction. They knew that what they were doing wasn't revenge for him, it was justice with him on. The third night, the SEALs moved to the final phase, exposure. They hacked into the HOA's private group page, uploading the full footage of the beating alongside the names and faces of every man involved. The video spread through the community like a wildfire with no wind. The polished image of the protectors shattered overnight. Their families faced questions. Their businesses burned with shame, and the police who had ignored Marcus suddenly rediscovered urgency. But the SEALs weren't finished. They weren't satisfied with humiliation alone. The men responsible had built their confidence on dominance, so that's what had to be taken next. Dawn, Jeff, the HOA leader, woke to find his front yard stripped bare, not vandalized, but organized. Every tool from his shed, every piece of furniture laid out with military precision in perfect lines across the grass. At the center stood a single wooden plank carved with one phrase burned into it. Honor belongs to those who earn it. No fingerprints, no witnesses, just fear, clean, deliberate fear. By the 4th night, the attackers no longer left their homes. Curtains stayed drawn, lights flickered nervously through cracks. The suburb's stillness had turned on itself. For years it had been a fortress of quiet oppression, now it was a cage for those who'd built it. Marcus's seal. Brothers never celebrated. They didn't drink, didn't joke. Each of them carried ghosts. And this act wasn't cleansing. It was heavy, necessary, and finite. They knew the line between justice and vengeance could blur fast, and they refused to cross it. But the neighborhood had changed. The fake HOA disbanded. The official police investigation, suddenly enthusiastic, led to arrests and resignations. The community that once whispered about Marcus now spoke his name differently, with guilt, respect, and unease, and yet, through all of it, Marcus stayed silent. He mowed his lawn, saluted his flag, and rebuilt his peace. But something inside him had shifted permanently. He had seen what happens when good men stay silent. And what happens? When they stop, the air in the neighborhood had grown unnaturally still. The laughter that once echoed from driveways was gone, replaced by the hum of locked doors and drawn blinds. The men who once ruled the cul-de-sac through arrogance and fear were now prisoners of their own paranoia. But justice, Marcus knew, was never complete until it was faced, not fled. It was the fifth night when the storm finally broke. The SEAL team watched from the shadows as Jeff, the self-proclaimed Cho leader, stumbled outside. His face was hollow, eyes darting toward the streetlights as if expecting ghosts. He had called emergency meetings, begged for police patrols even, installed cameras of his own. But fear, once it enters a man's bones, becomes its own, haunting. Marcus stood at the edge of his driveway, motionless, arms crossed. For days he had been silent, watching his brothers execute precision justice with control. But now it was his moment not to strike, but to reclaim. Jeff froze when he saw him standing there. The same driveway where arrogance had once beaten. Decency was now a battlefield reversed. The same ground that had tasted Marcus's blood now held his composure. The power dynamic that once fed on silence now trembled beneath it. From across the street, the SEALs observed, ready but still. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about closure, the kind earned, not taken. Jeff tried to maintain posture, to summon the authority that had long abandoned him. But Marcus didn't move. He simply stepped forward, each stride, deliberate, calm, commanding. The man who had once been a victim now radiated something far heavier, the dignity of a soldier who no longer needed violence to prove his strength. As Marcus passed him, Jeff flinched, a reflex born not from guilt but recognition. Recognition that the world had changed. The false order he'd built was collapsing, and the man he'd tried to break was now the mirror, reflecting his cowardice. Marcus stopped just short of the mailbox, the same one that had once carried those anonymous warnings. He pulled the last of those letters from his jacket pocket, the crumpled paper a relic of their hate. Without ceremony, he tore it into pieces and let the fragments fall onto the pavement. The wind caught them, scattering them across lawns that no longer belonged to anyone but truth. No words were needed. His silence was louder than any confrontation could be. Behind him, the SEALs stepped forward. From the shadows, 6 figures emerging into the light, their presence alone enough to make the night shift. They stood there not as soldiers, but as witnesses. They weren't there to fight. They were there to stand with him, to prove that loyalty didn't end when wars did. Jeff's knees weakened. The bravado that had fueled his cruelty dissolved into trembling denial. He turned toward his house but found no comfort there. His porch light flickered, exposing him to the eyes of every neighbor peering through curtains. For years he had dictated who belonged. Now he was the outsider. Marcus turned and walked back toward his home, the one he had built, defended, and nearly died on the steps of. His brothers followed behind him. Formation, tight steps, synchronized, a silent salute to the man who had led them once and now led again, without orders, without weapons. As they reached the door, the rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavy, washing the dust and memory of violence from the street. The sound filled the night like an unspoken benediction. The lawns, the fences, the spotless driveways, all of it blurred into something equal under the downpour. Inside, Marcus stood by the window, watching Jeff retreat into the darkness of his own making. Justice, he realized, isn't about balance. It's about truth. And sometimes the truest justice doesn't demand punishment. It demands remembrance. He turned to his team. The storm outside raged, but inside there was stillness. The kind of stillness only earned after doing what's right, not what's easy. They didn't need to speak. Each of them understood the cost of silence and the price of conscience. As dawn began to touch the rooftops, Marcus felt something unfamiliar. Peace, not the fragile kind he once sought in quiet suburbs, but the kind forged through confrontation, through standing firm when the world tries to fold you down. Outside, the wind carried the last scraps of that torn letter down the street, past the manicured lawns, past the empty porches, past the illusions of power, until they vanished into the gutter where all lies eventually belong. The storm passed by, morning leaving behind streets washed clean, not just of dirt, but of illusion. The neighborhood, once proud of its symmetry and silence, now carried the uneasy stillness of reckoning. The fences still stood, but the invisible walls had cracked. Marcus stepped out onto his porch as the first rays of sunlight cut through the mist. The world looked the same, but it felt different. The air was lighter, not because the hate was gone, but because it had been exposed. The truth, once buried, had finally breathed. He walked to the edge of his driveway where the rainwater gathered in tiny rivers carrying leaves. Soil and fragments of that torn led down the gutter. It struck him how easy it was for filth to flow away, but stains the kind that sink deep into conscience linger long after the surface shines. The seals had already left before dawn, quiet as they had come. No handshakes, no goodbyes. They didn't need them. Their bond was carved in something deeper than words. They knew Marcus would stand tall now, not because they had avenged him, but because he had remembered who he was, a man who fought, not for power, but for principle. As he looked around, he noticed subtle changes. The flags outside homes hung lower as if in quiet shame. The once loud homeowners stayed indoors longer, their windows shaded, their pride hollowed. For the first time since he'd moved there, the neighborhood wasn't watching him, it was watching itself. Weeks passed. The police investigations that once dismissed his pain turned serious under public pressure. The video that the seals had leaked had spread beyond the community, picked up by local outlets, then national ones. The footage had no sound, but it didn't need it. The image of a decorated black veteran beaten on his own driveway by neighbors who smiled in church the next morning. It was enough to tear through. Denial talk shows debated it. Commentators twisted it. Politicians condemned it. But Marcus stayed quiet. He had nothing left to prove. The noise outside no longer mattered, the silence within. Him had meaning now, one morning, as he tended to the small garden he'd planted by his porch. A boy from the neighborhood rode by on his bike. He stopped, hesitated, and then gave a nervous wave. Marcus nodded back, small, unforced. It was the first real gesture of change. Not apology, not guilt, just recognition. And sometimes that's where healing begins. At night, Marcus would sit on his porch looking at the stars. Again, the same stars he had once seen from deserts halfway around the world. Back then, they had reminded him of home. Now they reminded him of purpose, not the kind tied to rank or mission, but to the simple idea that every human being deserves respect, not permission. The media eventually moved on, as it always does. The headlines shifted. New scandals replaced old ones. But for the people who lived on that street, the silence never returned to what it was before. They could no longer hide behind their rules or their polite prejudice. The illusion had been shattered too thoroughly. Marcus knew that justice was never perfect. The arrests, the apologies, they couldn't rewrite what had happened, but he didn't need them to. The victory wasn't in punishment. It was in exposure. It was in showing that even the most civilized places could harbor rot, and that light, once turned on, doesn't go out so easily. Months later, he received a letter. No name, no signature. Just a few words written in uneven handwriting. I see things differently now. I'm teaching my son to do the same. He folded the paper gently and placed it beside the framed photo of his SEAL team. It wasn't forgiveness, it was progress. And progress, he knew, is the rarest kind of revenge. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Marcus stood by his driveway, the same spot where it all began. The scars on his face had faded, but the lessons carved deeper. He looked at the quiet houses, the empty sidewalks, the still air, and for the first time, it didn't feel hostile. It felt honest. He took a long breath and whispered a truth that had carried him through every battlefield, every loss, every moment of injustice. Strength isn't about striking back. It's about standing up even when standing alone. The wind rose again, carrying his words into the twilight. Somewhere behind closed doors, maybe someone heard them. Maybe someone learned, and maybe, just maybe, the next time a man like Marcus moved into a neighborhood like this, the silence that greeted him wouldn't be made of hate. Final takeaway: racism doesn't always wear a hood or carry a weapon. Sometimes it hides behind fences, smiles, and rules. But when truth finally arrives, whether through courage, exposure, or quiet defiance, it doesn't ask for permission to stay. It simply reminds the world dignity is not negotiable.